Welcome back to our deep dive into hunting in British Columbia. Um, this is actually our third module.
Wow, third already.
I know, right? Time flies.
Yeah.
So we've already talked about conservation and wildlife management. And of course, we can't forget hunting ethics.
The foundation of it all.
Yeah, so now we're ready to really get into the nitty-gritty, the regulation.
Oh, yes, the rules of the game.
Exactly. And to help us with that, we're going to be taking a look at a very important document, the Hunting and Trapping Regulations Synopsis.
This synopsis, it's really the hunter's Bible in BC, packed with need-to-know information for everyone, from seasoned hunters to those just starting out.
Yeah, and you know what's interesting to me is that this synopsis isn't just some dry list of rules.
Yeah.
It actually reflects everything we've talked about so far.
Oh, absolutely. The regulations are carefully crafted to uphold those principles of conservation, ensure public safety, and even promote those ethical hunting practices, all those things we discussed in previous modules.
Yeah, it's all connected. Like thinking back to our module on conservation, how do these regulations actually support those principles in action?
Well, regulations act as a safeguard against overharvesting.
Right.
Making sure that, future generations can enjoy the same hunting opportunities
That
we have today.
Like protecting those wildlife populations for the long term.
Exactly. And a perfect example of this is how the province responded to the emergence of chronic wasting disease, or CWD.
Oh, CWD.
When the first cases were found in BC back in 2024, they immediately implemented a CWD response plan, using regulations for mandatory testing and restrictions in affected areas.
So a real-world example of how regulations can adapt to new challenges.
Precisely, it shows how regulations are a dynamic tool for responding to those real-world conservation concerns.
Okay, so let's get into the structure of this synopsis.
Yeah.
How is it laid out? What should hunters really pay attention to?
Well, it's designed to be user-friendly. It's structured to guide you through all the essential information. You have sections like Before You Hunt and articles and forms, which might sound basic, but they actually hold a wealth of knowledge that goes beyond just hunting dates and bag limits.
Yeah, I bet a lot of people skip over those sections.
They do, and it's a mistake. Take the definitions section, for example. You might think it's boring, but trust me, understanding those definitions is critical. It can help avoid accidental violations.
Okay, so give us an example. What kind of definition could trip someone up?
Well, let's say you're hunting cougar. The synopsis has a specific definition for cougar kitten. Any cougar with spots or under 1 year old. If you misidentify a cougar and harvest one that meets that definition, you could face some serious consequences.
Yikes. Okay, good point. Knowing those definitions can really save you some trouble. Now let's talk about licenses, because everyone needs one, right?
Absolutely. And the synopsis covers a whole range of license types. Hunting licenses, species licenses, youth licenses, initiation licenses, even non-resident licenses.
And what about the Fish and Wildlife ID?
The FWID.
Right.
It's basically your hunter's passport in BC.
So it's like your unique identifier.
Exactly.
Now I imagine residency plays a big role in all of this.
Absolutely. Hunting opportunities in BC are primarily allocated to BC residents. It's about ensuring fair access to those who call BC home.
Right. So does that mean non-residents can't hunt at all?
Not at all. Non-residents can obtain licenses, but they face certain restrictions, especially for big game. They always need to be accompanied by a guide.
Regardless of their license type?
Regardless of their license type.
Interesting. So the regulations try to find a balance between resident and non-resident hunters. There's another topic we need to touch on, and it's a sensitive one. Aboriginal hunting rights.
Yes, and the synopsis acknowledges the constitutionally protected rights of First Nations to harvest wildlife. They have a vital role in wildlife stewardship in BC.
So how do the provincial regulations work with Aboriginal hunting rights?
First Nations members who reside in BC, they don't actually need provincial licenses to hunt. But the emphasis is always on sustainable and safe harvesting practices.
Okay, so it's about respecting those rights while also making sure the harvesting is done responsibly.
Exactly. And if there are conservation concerns, the ministry consults with the affected First Nations to determine if any regulations are needed. It's a collaborative process.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about finding solutions that work for everybody. Now let's get into some specifics. What are some of the restrictions and prohibitions that might surprise hunters, especially those new to BC?
Well, for starters, you can't just shoot anywhere you like. Did you know that discharging a firearm is prohibited within 100 meters of most regional district parks?
Really? Had no idea.
Yeah, it's about public safety. And of course, you can't hunt in national wildlife areas.
Right, those are protected areas.
Exactly. And you also can't hunt on Indian reserves without permission from the band.
Okay, so it's about respecting those boundaries.
And understanding the designated areas. Now, another important thing to remember is the Off-Road Vehicle Act, or the ORV Act.
Right, this applies to hunters using ATVs or snowmobiles.
Precisely. The ORV Act dictates where and how you can operate those vehicles on Crown land.
So it's another layer of regulations to be aware of.
Absolutely.
Now let's move on to bag limits and reporting. Can you explain the concept of bag limits?
Well, sure. Each species has a designated bag limit. It can be a daily limit or a seasonal limit, and these limits can vary by region.
Right, so it's not just what you can hunt, but how much you can harvest.
Exactly. And these limits are based on scientific data to prevent over-harvesting and to maintain healthy wildlife populations.
So it's all part of that sustainable wildlife management approach.
Precisely.
And what about reporting?
Reporting is crucial. It provides valuable data for monitoring populations and for making those informed decisions about hunting seasons and regulations.
So it's like giving back to the system
Exactly.
by providing that information.
And there's also the retrieval regulation, which emphasizes making every reasonable effort to retrieve downed game.
So that's part of ethical hunting.
Absolutely minimizing waste.
Okay, and what about mandatory hunter reports?
You have to submit those. And the synopsis outlines different methods for doing so, but the key thing is to report accurately and promptly.
Because that data is so important for those management decisions.
Precisely.
And we've also heard about something called compulsory inspection.
Yes, but we'll get into that a bit later.
Okay, so before we move on, let's talk about handling game meat safely.
That's essential after a successful hunt. You want to make sure that meat is safe to consume.
Right. What are some key things to keep in mind?
Well, the synopsis recommends wearing gloves when field dressing and boning out the meat, and also minimizing contact with brain and spinal tissue.
Those are good safety precautions.
It helps reduce the risk of transmitting diseases.
And this also ties into that edible portions regulation.
Right. Hunters have a responsibility to utilize the game they harvest.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. The why behind regulations, specific restrictions, safe meat handling. But before we move on, let's circle back to compulsory inspection.
Yeah.
What exactly is it and why is it important?
Well, compulsory inspection is a vital tool for wildlife managers. It provides them with valuable information about the health and population dynamics of harvested species.
So it's like a health check for wildlife.
Exactly.
And the synopsis lists the specific species that require inspection.
Right, and the specific regions and management units can be found on the regional maps.
Okay, so this helps inform those management decisions.
Precisely.
So where do hunters go for this inspection?
You'll need to take your harvested animal to a designated compulsory inspection location.
And those locations are also listed on the maps.
Yes, and appointments are usually required.
Okay. And what happens during the inspection?
They'll examine specific parts of the animal to collect data.
Can you give us a specific example?
Sure, for sheep, moose, and caribou, you'll need to provide an incisor tooth for inspection.
Wow, so they really get into the details.
It's about gathering that essential data.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to bring it back to ethics. We discussed this in a previous module, but how do the regulations themselves actually promote ethical hunting?
Well, the synopsis is full of reminders about ethical behavior. For example, it emphasizes respecting landowners and obtaining permission before hunting on private land.
Right, that's crucial.
And it stresses the importance of clean kills and minimizing suffering.
So it's about being a responsible and respectful hunter.
Absolutely. And if anyone is looking to expand their knowledge and really hone their skills, I highly recommend checking out the BC Firearms Academy.
Oh yeah, they're a fantastic resource.
They offer a variety of things like free online courses, in-person training, and core challenge exams.
So something for everyone.
Exactly.
It's a great way to become a more responsible and ethical hunter.
Precisely.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive, but there's so much more to explore in the synopsis.
It's a really comprehensive document.
So we'll continue our journey through the hunting and trapping regulation synopsis in the next module.
Looking forward to it.
Me too.
Okay, so let's dive back into the synopsis and uncover some of those hidden gems that can really make a difference for having a successful and legal hunt.
I like it, hidden gems.
Yeah.
What do we have?
Well, we touched on the basics of licensing, but the synopsis goes deeper than that, outlining specific variations that cater to different needs and experience levels.
Okay, that's interesting. What are some of those lesser-known license options?
Well, for young hunters, you have the youth hunting license for those aged 10 to 17.
Okay.
And they can choose between a standard hunting license with a personal bag limit or a youth license where their harvest is added to the bag limit of an accompanying adult.
Oh, that's interesting. So it allows young hunters to gain experience alongside a mentor.
Exactly. It's all about passing on that knowledge and those values to the next generation.
Yeah, that reminds me of our discussion on mentorship and ethical hunting.
It's all connected. And speaking of introducing people to hunting, there's also the initiation hunting license.
What's that?
It's designed for adults who are brand new to hunting, BC residents 18 or older, who have never held a BC hunting license before.
So it's like a trial run for new hunters.
Yeah, a chance to dip their toes into the hunting world without completing the full hunter safety training program up front.
Okay, but is there a catch?
Well, similar to the youth license, the initiation hunting license doesn't have a personal bag limit. The harvest is added to the accompanying adult's bag limit.
So similar safeguards in place.
Exactly.
Now, we talked about non-resident hunters needing guides for big game. Does the synopsis go into more detail about the requirements for non-residents?
It does. Non-resident hunters, those are Canadian citizens or permanent residents who don't actually live in BC, they can hunt here. But they need to follow specific regulations. First, they need a non-resident hunting license. And then they have a choice between a restricted or unrestricted license.
Okay, so what's the difference?
Well, to get an unrestricted license, you need to prove that you've completed hunter safety training. That meets BC's requirements.
Okay.
Now, with a restricted license, you don't need to provide that proof of training. But it means you'll always need a guide.
Even for small game?
Even for small game.
Okay, so the unrestricted license gives you more flexibility.
If you can demonstrate that hunter safety competency.
Makes sense.
And there's another interesting aspect for non-residents, the permit to accompany.
Okay, what is that?
So let's say you have friends or family visiting from another province, and they want to hunt big game with you.
Okay.
They would normally need a guide. But there's an alternative. You, as a BC resident, can apply for a permit to accompany.
So I could be their guide.
Exactly. You could accompany them, share your knowledge, and make sure they're following all the regulations.
Oh, that's cool. So I could take my out-of-province buddies hunting.
Exactly.
But I bet there are qualifications.
Of course. You need to be at least 19 years old, and you need to have held a BC hunting license and a big game species license for at least 3 out of the past 5 years.
Okay, so you need to be experienced.
Makes sense, Ray?
Yeah, you don't want someone inexperienced leading others.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about licenses. Now let's shift gears and talk about firearms and archery regulations.
Okay.
What are some key things hunters need to know in this area?
Well, the synopsis outlines the specific types of firearms and archery equipment that are allowed for different species, emphasizing safety and ethical use.
Right, so it's not just about having the right gear, but using it responsibly.
Exactly.
So where do hunters find this information in the synopsis?
There's a handy table that lists the permitted firearms and archery equipment for each species.
Okay, so it's all laid out clearly.
It is, for example, for big game like moose and elk, you can generally use centerfire rifles, but shotguns are not allowed. And for smaller game, like coyote or bobcat, both rifles and shotguns are permitted. But there are limitations on the types of ammunition you can use.
Okay, so you really need to pay attention to that table.
Absolutely.
Make sure you're using legal equipment.
For your target species.
Are there any other restrictions in this section?
Yes. The synopsis also specifies magazine capacity restrictions for certain firearms, for example, when hunting migratory game birds. Your shotgun magazine cannot hold more than 3 shells.
Oh, interesting.
It's about fair chase and responsible hunting practices.
Right, it's not about taking as many shots as possible.
Exactly.
It's about respecting the animals and the sport.
Exactly.
Now, what about archery equipment? Are there specific requirements for bows and arrows?
Absolutely. The synopsis covers different bow types, like longbows, recurve bows, compound bows, and crossbows, each with its own set of regulations, for example. For big game hunting with a bow, the arrow must have a broadhead of at least 78 of an inch at its widest point.
Wow, so specific.
It's all about ensuring a quick and humane harvest.
Right, that makes sense.
And, all this talk about equipment really highlights the importance of practice and proficiency.
Yeah, you need to be comfortable and competent with your gear.
Exactly. And that's where resources like the BC Firearms Academy can be so valuable.
Right, they offer those courses.
On everything from basic firearm safety to advanced hunting techniques.
Yeah, it's a great way to hone those skills.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered licenses, firearms, and archery regulations. Now let's move on to hunting seasons.
Okay.
How does the Synopsis help hunters navigate this whole world of dates and timelines?
Well, BC has a variety of hunting seasons, tailored to different species and regions.
Right, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Definitely not. And the synopsis breaks down all these details. So hunters can legally hunt specific species in specific areas at specific times.
Okay, so you need to be aware of the species and the region.
Exactly.
And these seasons are carefully designed.
To align with the animal's biological cycles, ensuring that hunting occurs during periods when populations are healthy and sustainable.
Right.
So, for example, the deer hunting season might start earlier in one region than in another.
Okay.
And even within a region, there might be variations, depending on whether you're using a firearm or a bow.
Oh, so there could be a bow-only season.
That starts before the general firearm season.
Interesting. Are there any other nuances within those seasons?
Yes. The synopsis also details any restrictions within a season.
Okay.
For instance, during a deer season, there might be a period where you can only harvest bucks with a certain number of antler points.
Oh, right, those antler point restrictions. We talked about selective harvesting in our wildlife management module.
Exactly. All these regulations, like season dates and restrictions, they're all tools used to achieve those specific wildlife management objectives.
So it all ties back together.
It does.
Now we've covered licenses, firearms, and archery regulations, hunting seasons. What else should we consider before heading out?
Well, we need to talk about where you can and cannot hunt.
Right, we mentioned restrictions.
Yeah.
Near regionals, district parks,
Yeah.
and national wildlife areas. What other areas are off limits?
Well, the synopsis provides all those details. On-site and access restrictions.
Okay.
For example, hunting is prohibited within 100 meters of schools, playgrounds, hospitals, and community watersheds.
Right, you can't be hunting near those places.
Exactly. It's about public safety and
Yeah.
protecting sensitive areas.
Makes sense. Now, what about hunting near roads or highways?
Again, safety is paramount. You cannot discharge a firearm within 200 meters of the center of a public highway,
Okay.
and you can't shoot across a road, even if you're beyond that distance.
So even if you think you have a clear shot, you need to double-check your line of fire.
Absolutely.
What about using motorized vehicles for hunting? Any restrictions there?
Yes, this is where the Off-Road Vehicle Act comes into play again.
Right, the ORV Act.
Some areas might be completely closed to motorized vehicles,
Right.
while others have restrictions on specific vehicle types or times of the year.
Can you give us an example?
Sure, ATVs might be allowed, but snowmobiles are not. Or there might be seasonal restrictions during the spring thaw.
To protect those sensitive habitats.
Exactly.
So you really need to check the synopsis
And those regional maps.
for those specific restrictions.
Absolutely. And if there's ever any doubt, contact the Ministry of Environment's regional office.
Okay.
They can provide clarification.
Great resource.
They are.
Okay, so we've talked about restrictions in different areas. Now let's talk about private land access.
Okay.
This must be a big one in BC.
It is. With so much of the land privately owned, hunters need to be aware of the hails.
And what does the synopsis say about that?
It's very clear. You must obtain permission from the landowner before hunting on private land.
So no trespassing.
Exactly. It's not just a matter of courtesy, it's the law.
Okay, so how do hunters go about getting permission?
Direct and respectful communication is key. Reach out to the landowner well in advance, explain your intentions, provide details about the species you're targeting, your hunting dates, any other relevant information.
So be upfront and honest?
Exactly, and even with permission, all other hunting regulations still apply.
Right, so you still need to follow season dates, bag limits,
Yeah.
and ethical hunting practices.
Absolutely, it's about being a responsible hunter on both public and private land.
Respecting the landowner's wishes and the environment.
Precisely.
Okay, now let's move on to a topic that's often shrouded in mystery. Trapping regulations.
Ah, yes.
What could you tell us about that?
The synopsis has a whole section dedicated to trapping. It's a highly regulated activity, and the synopsis covers everything from licensing and trapline registration to humane trapping standards.
Wow.
and reporting requirements.
So if you're interested in trapping, this section is your guide.
Absolutely.
Can you walk us through some of the key aspects?
Sure. First off, you need a trapping license, which
Yeah.
is separate from your hunting license. And to get this license, you need to pass a trapper education course.
So similar to the hunter safety training.
Exactly.
Makes sense.
This course covers trapping ethics, animal welfare, trap selection and placement, fur handling techniques.
So it's about equipping trappers with the knowledge and skills to trap responsibly and ethically.
Precisely.
Okay, so once you have your trapping license,
Yeah.
what's next?
You can register a trap line.
What's a trap line?
It's a designated area where you have exclusive trapping rights for fur-bearing animals.
So it's like your own territory for trapping.
You could say that.
Now, what are the responsibilities that come with trap line registration?
Well, trappers are responsible for maintaining their trap lines, making sure traps are in good working order, and minimizing disturbance to other wildlife and habitats.
Okay.
There are also regulations on the types of traps you can use, emphasizing those humane trapping standards.
Right, minimizing suffering.
Exactly.
Are there any restrictions on where you can set traps?
Yes, you need to stay 100 meters away from dwellings, campsites, playgrounds, schools, and other designated areas,
So it's about public safety.
and minimizing conflict.
Sounds like these regulations aim to find a balance between allowing trapping and ensuring it's done responsibly and safely.
Exactly.
Now, we've talked about ethical hunting. Is ethical behavior also important in trapping?
Absolutely. Trappers are expected to treat animals with respect, minimize suffering, avoid waste, and accurately report their harvest.
So those principles apply across the board,
They do.
and that reporting data helps with wildlife management.
Precisely, it helps monitor trapping activities and ensure the sustainability of those fur-bearer populations.
Okay, so whether you're a hunter or a trapper, the Synopsis is your go-to resource
It is.
for making sure you're doing things legally,
Yeah,
ethically, and responsibly.
exactly.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground in this module,
We have.
from specific license types to firearms regulations, private land access, and trapping.
It's a lot to take in.
It is, but it's all important.
Mm.
What are some key takeaways for our listeners?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the hunting and trapping regulation synopsis is more than just a rule book.
Right, it's a guide.
It's a comprehensive guide for navigating the world of hunting in BC.
And it reflects that interconnectedness
Hmm.
of conservation, hunting opportunities, and public safety.
Exactly. It's about understanding the why behind the regulations and embracing those ethical principles.
Right, it's about recognizing that we as hunters have a responsibility to ensure that hunting remains sustainable
And a valued tradition.
for generations to come.
Precisely.
Wow, it's amazing how much detail is packed into this synopsis.
I know, right?
It's really impressive. We've only scratched the surface, but it's clear that this document is essential for anyone who wants to hunt responsibly in BC.
It truly is, and what really stands out to me is how much emphasis is placed on ethics. It's woven throughout the entire document, reminding hunters of their responsibility to the wildlife, to the environment, and to the community.
It's not just about following the rules blindly, right?
Yeah. No, it's about understanding the spirit of the law, being a thoughtful and conscientious hunter.
Absolutely. Now, before we wrap up our deep dive, I want to shine a light on a section that often gets overlooked, but it's full of really valuable information. The articles and forms section,
Oh, yes, that section is a treasure trove.
like bonus features on a DVD.
Exactly.
What kind of gems can we find in there?
Well, there's a fantastic article on handling game meat safely. It's full of practical tips on processing your harvest and making sure it's safe to eat.
Right. It all ties back to utilizing those edible portions,
And minimizing waste.
respecting the animal.
Absolutely.
Any other articles that stand out?
There's a really informative one on wildlife health. It covers different diseases and health concerns that hunters should be aware of.
Oh, that's important.
It helps hunters make informed decisions
Yeah.
about the animals they harvest. And it can even contribute to those broader wildlife health monitoring efforts.
So it's like a mini crash course in wildlife health.
Right there in the synopsis.
Now, what about resources for new hunters or those who want to brush up on their skills?
Well, the synopsis has you covered there too. There's a section on hunter education, highlighting the importance of hunter safety training. And it points hunters towards available courses and resources.
Oh, that's handy.
And there's even a section on how to extract an incisor tooth.
Really?
Yeah, a little field biology lesson.
They really thought of everything.
They did.
Okay, so before we wrap up completely, I want to emphasize the importance of staying updated.
Oh, absolutely. The world of hunting is always evolving. New challenges, new scientific discoveries, and even changing societal values.
So it's not enough to just read the synopsis once.
Nope, hunters should always be looking for updates, attending workshops, engaging in conversations with fellow hunters, and wildlife experts.
It's a continuous learning process.
Exactly.
So as we conclude our deep dive into this hunting and trapping regulation synopsis, I think the main takeaway is that this document is a roadmap
It is.
for ethical and sustainable hunting in BC.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
It's about understanding those regulations, embracing those ethical principles, and actively participating in wildlife conservation.
And remember, the synopsis is just the starting point. Keep learning, keep engaging with the hunting community, and don't hesitate to seek clarification when you need it.
Because at the end of the day, responsible hunting is about so much more than just following rules. It's about respect
For wildlife.
for the environment.
And for this incredible tradition.
Well said. So with that in mind, we encourage all of you to embark on your hunting journeys, armed with knowledge, ethics, and a deep appreciation for the natural world.
Happy hunting, everyone.
Happy hunting.